that comes and visits the very site where the Endeavour crew landed can come and see them.
What do they mean to your community? That you say that they are the precious last ones of their kind, but what do they represent in your story and your history?
Yeah, the spears are very significant in our ontology at Botany Bay, and they're also they represent the way that our old people would survive off the land. Our community still teaches, our elders in our community still teach how to make the spears the old way. But for all Australians, it shows a point in time where the shared history between Aboriginal people and the British began.
Professor Thomas, I think you've written and studied Captain Cook yourself. What do we know of the circumstances in which he came to take these spears?
Cook attempted to land at Botany Bay. The landing was resisted by two Guayagal men. Cook and others in the party then fired on those men, one of whom was injured slightly. The Aboriginal people then withdrew from the scene. The British ventured a little way inland and found a camp with this set of spears lying around. They were concerned that they were weapons. The naturalist Joseph Banks thought that they were poisoned. They took them away. This was an act of disarmament, not of scientific collecting in any sense. The spears were then, presumably the bulk of them were brought back to England, but only the four, which were given by Cook to his patron, Lord Sandwich of the Admiralty, and by him to Trinity College, are extant today.
Do we know why? Is it just that you don't know where they are because they ended up in private hands elsewhere? I mean, they could still be, couldn't they, in someone's house?
One of the incredibly rewarding things about the relationship between the museum, between Cambridge researchers and La Perouse over the last over 5 years has been a commitment to engage in shared research. So we've been trying to track down artefacts from the Sydney region that are in Australia. In fact, a wider group of artefacts from a number of British museums are on display in Sydney now. Another dimension of this project. I hope that more spears do emerge in due course. We believe some of them were in other museums late in the 18th century or the early 19th, but we are yet to track those down.
And Ray, how long has this dialogue of yours with the museum or the owners of the spear, which is Trinity College, how long has it taken?
One of our elders first approached Trinity about 20 years ago, but we never had a suitable place or the capacity to keep them in a museum-grade facility so we can, they can live for another 250 years. But now we have that. We're working closely with the National Museum of Australia and IACSIS to make sure that they are preserved and stored appropriately, and they'll be displayed at a facility, an exhibition facility on the very site they were taken in 1770.
College and for the museum as they leave Cambridge today. Ray Ingrie and Professor Nicholas Thomas, thank you very much.
12 minutes to 9. Should we do more to tax tourists? There was plenty of chat about doing it. In Kent, Thanet Council is toying with charges for overnight stays. There are already schemes in Liverpool and Manchester. The authorities in Wales are considering it. Perhaps Venice is a model. From Thursday, day trippers to Venice are going to have to pay €5 to get into the city. People staying overnight already pay a city charge in their hotel bills. Simone Venturini spoke to us earlier.
Taxing tourists is good for the city because we can collect money to use in the services. A cleaning city in Venice is very difficult because it's all cleaned by hand. We have no truck, no car, just boats and brushes. So it's very expensive. And all the services are expensive. We have transport, we don't have coaches, we have the water costs. It's very expensive. So we need money to make the city running. And the overnight tourists, they pay city tax, and we walk even the day trippers pay something.
Let's talk to Victoria Winkler, who is director of the think tank, the Bevan Foundation, and to Philip Thorley as well, who's a local businessman in Kent, owns quite a few hospitality venues, including a hotel, a couple of pubs with rooms as well. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning.
Mr. Thorley, first of all, your thoughts on the prospect, at least, of a tourist tax in Kent?
We're already the most taxed country in Europe. Certainly our industry, the hospitality industry, pays more tax than any other industry in the UK. And I think, quite frankly, they're trying to get blood out of the stone, Justin.
You think that it will significantly damage you, do you, if there is a tax? In other words, it won't be just that people pay a little extra, still come, and that little extra then makes the place a pleasanter place to live. It won't, you think, work like that?
No, I don't think it will work like that. At the moment, you know, we pay an incredible amount of tax, and so do our consumers and customers who come down to our little part of the world in the Mediterranean and Kent. And, you know, they are finding that they are in a credit crunch at the moment. The pound in their pocket, they're trying to stretch it to go further. And it's very, very difficult. And I think that taking more off them just in a form of another tax to go to the local council is quite simply unfair.
Victoria Winkler?
Well, we see a tourist tax as a way of getting a balance between the costs of tourism, but something that's not so high as to hit the industry. And set at the right level, so most people talk about round about £1 per person per night. It really should not be affecting people. For a 3-night stay for a couple, you're looking at £6. But that can make all the difference to the facilities that are there in that community.
Well, what kind of difference could it make?
Well, in Manchester, for example, it's raised around about 3 million. I think in smaller places you wouldn't be looking at that sort of revenue, but it could help to cover the costs of clearing up litter, keeping beaches clean, providing toilets, all those things that the tourist industry does bring with it.
That's the point, isn't it, Philip Thorley, that if it was used, the argument for it is if it's used well, it benefits everyone, including the tourists.
The local council down here is already financially stretched, and I don't think that any money raised from a tourist tax would actually come back to benefit the tourists. We paid extremely high business rates as it stands at the moment, and that is to pay for the facilities that the people that come into the area need to use and the businesses need to use. We are already paying this money out, and I don't think that we need to be adding to that whatsoever. I mean, we'd much rather be talking about attracting people down into the area to come down and see our beautiful coasts. We have the most sunshine in the whole of the UK. We don't want to be talking about being taxed even further, Justin.
But the point then, Dr. Winkler, is can these taxes, however they're constituted, be hypothecated? Can they avoid being lost into the general coffers? And is that the experience where it's happening at the moment?
It can be, yes. It depends on how the scheme is designed. So in Manchester, the money goes straight back to the local businesses and they decide how they use it. In the kind of model that we're proposing, it would go back to the local authorities. And at the end of the day,
do you accept that point that if it goes to the local authorities, it's just going to be lost? Because local authorities got a ton of things they need to spend money on, and it will just mean that people won't see the benefits of it in a way that is tangible to them.
Well, where a local authority has a good relationship with local tourism businesses, and most do, then that is a matter for discussion. There are hidden costs of tourism as well, don't forget. Things like shortages of housing, seasonal jobs, and so it needs to help with some of those costs as well.
Dr. Victoria Winkler and Philip Thorley as well. Thank you both very much.
It is now 7 minutes to 9.
There is a great celebration of Shakespeare's birthday, but we're doing it in a particular way on the programme today. This is commonly thought to be his birthday, but should he be remembered today not just as a playwright but also as a mathematician? According to Rob Eastway, who is an author of, among other things, Much Ado About Numbers, the playwright, according to Rob, relished the mathematical innovations of his time. And Rob is here in the studio. Good morning. Good morning to you. Before we discuss some of those, let's just hear a couple more clips. We played a clip earlier on, but let's play a couple more clips that I think might be relevant to all of this. So a play on the idea of division. So spending the night with Romeo, Juliet must make sure he leaves before they're caught. She curses the lark for bringing in the dawn, meaning Romeo has to go. Joa Ander read this for us.
It is the lark that sings so out of tune, straining harsh discords and unpleasing sharps. Some say the lark makes sweet division. This doth not so, for she divideth us.
And if that doesn't convince you, how about the concept of zero from the opening of Henry V? The chorus announcing that this small troupe of actors will recreate the glorious history of the Battle of Agincourt. This is read by Christopher Eccleston.
Can this cockpit hold the vasty fields of France? Or may we cram within this wooden hull the very casks that did affright the air at Agincourt? Oh, pardon. Since a crooked figure may attest in little place 1,000,000, and let us, ciphers to this great account, on your imaginary forces work.
Well, Rob Oostway, as I say, is here in the studio, author of Much Ado About Numbers, also director of Maths Inspiration, which is a lecture programme for older teenagers. Morning to you.
Good morning.
Your thesis is what?
My thesis is we think of Shakespeare as a guy who's creative with words, but actually, as I've investigated him, it turns out he's very creative with numbers too, and he lived in a Renaissance era where subjects were joined together much more than they are now, really. So, you know, what started as a project as a bit of a joke at a teacher conference in Stratford-on-Avon, a friend and I thinking, oh, let's just theme some maths things on Shakespeare and love triangles and so on. But as I investigated and began searching his work for mathematical words and so on, just began to discover a rich mathematical connection in the world around him, which he mentions and refers to in various ways.
And you made the point that in a clever person of that age, that wouldn't have been unusual. I mean, you did have an understanding of things or an interest in things in the round much more than you.
A curiosity. I mean, he would not have had much of a maths education. He would have learned arithmetic, so his mathematics would have been very arithmetical. But then even mathematicians, you know, arithmetic was quite a new and growing discipline. And that quote we heard from Henry V is really interesting because one wonderful discovery I made is that basically Shakespeare was the first generation in England to have learned what we now call our regular numerals, the Indo-Arabic numerals. His dad would have been a Roman numerals guy and wouldn't have recognised these things. What we now call zero, that word is a French word, zero, it hadn't arrived in England. It was called the cipher. And clearly Shakespeare is fascinated by the cipher because it's the thing that represents nothing, and yet it can make numbers really big. And so there we are in Henry V, basically saying there's only 7 of us on the stage, but if one of us is a 1 and the others are ciphers, zeros, we can make 1,000,000. Let's imagine we're 1,000,000.
And that it's his enjoyment too.
I think so, and the way he plays with numbers, that he will, instead of saying 100 or 50, sorry, he'll say half 100 or double 5 and 20. And throughout, I mean, one of my favourite examples is in Othello, actually, where Bianca is saying, oh, Cassio, you've been away for a week, 7 days, but she goes further and says, I want to say how many hours it is. Now, I didn't know how many hours there are in a week, it's not commonly known, it's 168, but Shakespeare doesn't say 168, he says 8 score 8, 8 times 20 plus 8. So not only has he worked it out, but he's made it poetic, it fits in 3 syllables, it's beautiful, and he does this time and again, and it's just not something I think that anyone, including me, would ever have thought about as him as a numbers guy.
The book is called Much Ado About Numbers. Rob Eastway, thank you.
Thank you.
Before we leave you, let's turn to the news that has been confirmed by French police in the last few minutes. News we start reporting in the last half hour that 5 people have died this morning trying to cross the channel. Tom Simons, our correspondent who's been on the beach at Calais, joins us again now. What do you know, Tom?
Well, simply that. A number of boats have left the beaches this morning. Certainly where we are on the beach just north of Calais, another boat tried to leave just south of Calais, between Calais and Boulogne, witnessed by a second BBC News team down there. And somewhere along that coast, as you say now, first reported by the French news outlet Le Voix du Nord and now by the French police, confirming it, 5 people have died. We don't have too many details. A colleague said he believed that it may have been related to an attempt to stop the boat as it kind of left the shore, but we don't have any more details than that at the moment. But we have witnessed a boat attempting to pick up a group of about 40 migrants from this beach where we are. The police not trying to stop the boat, but trying to stop the migrants getting to the boat, and those 40 getting onto a boat that was already carrying about 30 people. So we counted 67 people on board that small boat, every single inch of it covered with migrants. A small outboard motor which they did manage to start, and they headed out to sea, but we don't believe it got very far.
Tom Simons, thank you very much for that update from Calais.
That's it from us. After the news, Jim Al-Khalili will be talking to the astrophysicist Mike Edmonds about decoding galaxies and ancient astronomical artifacts. Tom Field and Dan McAdam were our editors. Rob Fanner in the studio. Goodbye.
BBC News at 9 o'clock. The Prime Minister says the eventual passing of his legislation to send some asylum seekers to Rwanda marks a fundamental change in dealing with migration. The House of Lords backed down over changes to the Safety of Rwanda bill after MPs rejected amendments on 5 occasions. Labour has described the Rwanda plan as an extortionately expensive gimmick. The Rwandan government says it's pleased the bill has got through Parliament and that it's looking forward to welcoming those who are relocating to Kigali. The Minister for Illegal Migration, Michael Tomlinson, told Today the government is determined to make the policy work.
I'm not going to go through a line by line of the possibilities of the ins and outs of all the multifarious legal challenges that there possibly could be. There will be legal challenges, we will meet them, and the planes will take off.
Reports in France say 5 people have died in an attempt to cross the Channel. The journey reportedly began from an area near the town of Wimereux in northern France. The French Coast Guard says an operation is ongoing. Official figures show annual public sector borrowing was higher than forecast. A total of £120.7 billion was driven by higher wages and benefit payments. A Treasury spokesperson said the government must stick to its plan to get debt falling. Rishi Sunak is to use a visit to Poland to pledge £500 million in military aid to Ukraine. The money will be used for ammunition, air defence equipment and drones. The Prime Minister is warning that President Putin will not stop at the Polish border if he's successful in Ukraine. Full-year results for Pure Gym show revenues grew to £549 million. The figure is a 15% increase on 2022. The gym chain also saw a 16% rise in memberships across the UK. A repatriation ceremony is due to take place in Cambridge to return 4 Aboriginal spears to Australia. The items were brought to England by Captain Cook more than 250 years ago. Trinity College says it's the right decision to give the spears back to the La Perouse Aboriginal community. BBC News.
We're discussing the all-important subject of sleep in half an hour here on Radio 4. Do you feel like you're getting enough of it? Do you wake up and then can't get back to sleep again? Or perhaps you have trouble switching off in the first place? Well, help is at hand as this week's Inside Health is dedicating a whole programme to our problems. You can pick up some tips at 9:30. Before that, The Life Scientific. Jim Al-Khalili finds out what galaxies are made of and how an artefact that inspired an Indiana Jones quest helped the ancient Greeks to track the planets.
Hello and welcome to The Life Scientific, coming to you complete with audience from the Royal Astronomical Society headquarters at London's Burlington House. Now, this is a place that holds special importance for my guest today, who first became a member of the RAS as an eager young student of physics back in the 1970s, and is now just coming to the end of his 2-year term as the Society's president. Mike Edmonds is an emeritus professor of astrophysics at Cardiff University, where he's worked for some 50 years. And although physics is his first love, Mike is fascinated by an array of disciplines, from statistics to amateur dramatics to history. Wide-ranging interests that once prompted a PhD supervisor to describe him, slightly tongue-in-cheek, as a dilettante. But dabblers seldom enjoy such success. Mike's achievements range from interpreting the spread of chemical elements in the universe to decoding the world's oldest known astronomical artifact, to performing his one-man play about Sir Isaac Newton. More about that shortly. Mike says he's taken great satisfaction in a career that's allowed him to think about the cosmos and our place in it. A calling which, of course, continues to this day. He says, like many of us, I continue to try and understand the story of the universe and how humankind has managed to discover the wider picture from our position on this speck of a planet orbiting the sun. Words that rather neatly point out our capacity for both accomplishment and insignificance. Professor Mike Edmonds, welcome to the Life Scientific.
Thank you, Jim.
Now, you're clearly a man of many talents, but much of your research has focused on the chemical abundances of stars. Can you just set out for us exactly what they are and why they're so important?
Well, when the universe started, essentially all that came out of the Big Bang in chemical terms was hydrogen, helium, and a tiny little bit of lithium. And all the chemical elements that are in the universe have formed since that time in various processes, in normal stars, in supernova explosions of stars, some possibly in the merger of neutron stars, and understanding those processes and how they've changed through time, how galaxies have built up the chemical elements they've got, is an interesting story and tells us a lot too about the evolution of the universe. So it's putting together that big jigsaw puzzle that I was interested in.
Now, obviously, there's a lot of important scientific ground that we're going to have to cover, but I did just mention your one-man play, Sir Isaac Remembers, and I think we do need to address this first. Am I right in saying this is a performance compiled entirely from Newton's own writing?
Essentially, plus a little bit of contemporary material, and the old ad-lib.
And, well, I'm going to put you on the spot here. I do wonder if you might give us a little taster.
Yeah? Ah, well, yeah. My Principia Mathematica, year 1687. Now, Mr. Halley told me that he thought it was my divine treatise. Nearer the gods no mortal man may approach. I thought all hours lost, not spent in study. But I remember, a student passed me in the street and he said to his companion, there goes the man that writ a book that neither he nor anyone else can understand. I do not know what I may seem to the world, but to myself I seem to have only been like a boy playing on the seashore and diverting myself now and then in finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, while the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me.
Wonderful stuff. It's almost as though Isaac Newton's here with us in the room. Well, Mike Edmonds, let's go back to the start of your story. You were born in 1949 in Dewsbury, Yorkshire, and that was one of several places your parents lived when you were young, because your father's job was in the railways.
He was. He'd been in the war. He'd been in the Royal Signals in the war. Having started, in fact, just before the war, going up to university and reading English. After the war, he went back to, I think, what must have been his first boyhood love of trains and railways. And he became what I believe is called a traffic apprentice and had to sort of go round and get jobs in various places to learn the ropes, as it were, before he then became eventually the Fat Controller, basically. So it was, and I think my own interest in trains, because I do love old steam trains, and models of them too, comes from those years, because when I was young, he used to sometimes take me out with him when he went to sort of see train wrecks up in the snow on the fells and things, and it's very difficult not to get a sort of romantic view of trains from that time.
You say he served in the war, World War II, of course. I gather his own father lost his life in the First World War.
Indeed, my grandfather, alas, died before he even knew his wife was pregnant. So he never knew, my grandfather, that he had a long line coming from him, which is a great shame.
Well, your father's job, of course, meant a lot of moving around the country for you, until you were 12, when he got a permanent position in Woking, in Surrey. And you started at the local grammar school there. You ended up taking A-levels in physics, chemistry, pure maths, applied maths, which earned you a place in Cambridge to read natural sciences, and the course kept you very busy.
Yeah, I should have done English or history or something. Science, natural sciences in those is legendary. The first year, you were doing 3 degrees, basically. So it was very, very hard work, but it was very exciting. because I started doing subjects which I'd never done before. For example, there was a course on the biology of cells. That was very, very interesting, but an awful lot of work.
Well, it paid off. You graduated with a degree in physics in the summer of 1971 and knew you wanted to go into research as a career, but you weren't quite sure where or what that might be.
No, I had a little look around. There are various universities obviously doing astronomy. I even went to Oxford to find out a bit about meteorology. I thought that might be an interesting one to do. The studentship they offered me, though, involved, they said, we want to know a lot more about the electric fields in thunderstorms. Fine, electromagnetism. What we're going to do is we're going to teach you to fly, and we're going to have a glider with the equipment on that you will build, and then you will fly the glider up into the thunderstorm to measure the electric fields. I decided astronomy might be safer.
So, instead you ended up doing a PhD at the Cambridge Observatory, involving a spectroscopic study of the light from stars. Maybe you can explain what that involves.
Well, we mentioned about chemical elements earlier. So how do you derive the abundance of chemical elements in stars? Well, the obvious way is through spectroscopy, splitting up the light, looking for the particular spectral lines that have a strength that's related to how much abundance there is in the stars. So basically I spent most of the PhD using the 36-inch telescope in Cambridge then. I think I had one observing of 10 continuous 14-hour nights in an unheated dome, and I managed to get an XRAF Arctic suit, which I wore, and then analysing those results with computers and so on.
I think it's an important point to make here about the science. As you say, to try and understand what stars are made of, we're not travelling to the star. All we can do is capture light, and it's the light that tells us everything about the composition of the universe.
The analysis, you say, you observe the spectrum, and then you have a lot of analytics to do, making computer models of the stellar atmospheres, the transfer of radiation through the atmospheres and what you expect to see, altering in your computer program how much abundance of nickel or whatever it is you put in until you can match the spectrum, and then try and get relative abundances of elements in different stars, and then relating the different kinds of stars and their different properties to see what you can learn about how the nuclear synthesis has taken place and what that's telling you about how star formation has progressed in galaxies, etc.
Well, that research at Cambridge came to an end with perfect timing because the University College of Wales in Cardiff, now Cardiff University, was just moving into astronomy. You applied, you secured a research fellowship, which would then end up becoming a permanent lectureship, and you moved to Wales. It was a busy first few years. Not only were you teaching, you embarking on new research, and it was around this time, mid-70s, that you embarked on a working relationship that would span decades with the esteemed astrophysicist Bernard Padgell of Sussex University and the Royal Greenwich Observatory. And your first joint project involved looking at the light coming from glowing gas regions in the Magellanic Clouds to dwarf galaxies near to our own Milky Way galaxy. Now, before we go any further, can you tell us a bit more about those spectra and why they're so important?
Well, stars are not necessarily very bright. There's some very bright stars, but most of them are not that bright compared with some other things in the universe. And if you want to analyse the chemical composition in galaxies near our own, and nowadays way away from our own, you really need something that's a little bit brighter than stars, although modern methods are helping that in nearby galaxies. So one of the things you can look at is regions of interstellar gas heated by young hot stars, because the gas itself then emits spectral lines, not the stars, the actual gas emits spectral lines.
It's hot enough to glow.
Indeed, and they can give very strong lines from the glowing gas region, and then you can analyse them again to get chemical compositions. Again, you have to make assumptions about the physical conditions and so on, but you can then begin to get information. And this program started just when the Anglo-Australian telescope, which was the first really decent telescope the UK had access to, a 3.9 metre telescope in Australia, came into use. And it was a wonderful opportunity to be able to observe these external galaxies, first the Magellanic Clouds, and then starting doing spiral galaxies and developing methods to do that. And I have to say, we did develop some methods of that are still actually used today. So it was a quite a successful program.
Of course, between trips to Australia, you were back in Cardiff, and it was around this time that your one-man play came into being. Tell me how it came about.
Well, it's one of those things. The Student Society, the Physics Society, heard I had an interest in Newton. I've been reading some books, and I must have made some remark in lectures about this. Said, well, could you give us a talk about Isaac Newton? I thought, well, talk would be a bit sort of dusty, so I thought, well, maybe I could do it as a sort of dramatic thing. And I had actually been looking at some of his letters. There's a big stack of his books of his letters in the library. So I prepared a sort of one-man show, about an hour, trying to sort of give it the idea of what he was like based on his letters. And he's a very interesting character. Not perhaps the nicest of men, but extremely interesting. And so that's how it started. Once I'd done it once, then I gradually began to go to other places, other astronomical societies, other science societies, a couple of times in the United States and so on. But it's only a couple of times a year.
Wonderful. Well, back to the science, Mike. In 1987, you became involved with efforts trying to convince the UK to build a world-leading telescope here.
Indeed. I've become, over the years, a member of many committees and working groups that looked at the observational facilities that the UK had. And by that time, it became obvious that we were going to be left out of the big lead unless we made a push to get bigger facilities. And in particular with Professor Richard Ellis, well, he was only a humble doctor then, at Durham University, we got together and informally and sort of said, well, look, we need to do something about this. And we wrote an informal report. It was sort of accepted, and what was set up then was called the Large Telescope Panel, which then worked for a couple of years trying to work out the best way for the UK to enter into a large telescope program. And that was successful. It resulted in the Gemini telescopes and eventually us joining the European Southern Observatory. So it was a transitionary time that led to making sure that the UK did have large observational facilities in the optical infrared.
And are we still doing well in astronomy? I mean, what's the state of UK astronomy sector today?
Well, I rate it as good. More money would be a very good thing, as ever, but we're still involved in very good projects. The European Southern Observatory is marvellous. It's heading towards what will be the biggest telescope in the world, the extremely large telescope, as they call it.
They're very imaginative names, aren't they?
Also, the UK is working with the Square Kilometre Array, which is a radio astronomy project that will come to fruition within the next few years. So I think we're doing very well, but we can't be complacent.
The government's Science, Innovation and Technology Committee held an inquiry into astronomy last year where you gave evidence, and you pointed out a major worry for professional astronomy. If there are too many satellites in orbit around the Earth, they're going to interfere inevitably with astronomical observations, aren't they?
Indeed, and people are now launching clusters of satellites, not just a single satellite, but maybe 1,000 satellites at a time in order to provide global coverage for this or that. Now, there are things that can be done. You can make sure that your satellites are dull, dark, and not reflecting light as best you can. That really needs international legislation to enforce that. So that's one thing you can do for optical telescopes. It's maybe even more of a worry for radio telescopes, though, because all of these satellites have to have telemetry back to the Earth and so on. And it's all right if they work well and stick to the frequency they're supposed to be broadcasting on. But if something goes wrong, and it's not broadcasting on the correct frequency or whatever, that can completely ruin an astronomical observation. So there's got to be international legislation that will minimise the effect on observations.
Well, Mike, back to Cardiff, where in 1997 you embarked on a new research project with some colleagues, particularly Steve Eales and then research student Hayley Gomez, a former guest, in fact, on the Life Scientific herself. This project spanned about a decade and was all about the origin of interstellar dust. Just remind me what you showed and how.
Interstellar dust, it's an interesting thing, but to some people it's an absolute nuisance because it gets in the way of the light coming through. For other people it's wonderful because it radiates and they can observe the radiation in distant galaxies from it. The problem was, where does it come from? And there had been many ideas. The sort of best buy at that time was it was producing the atmospheres of giant stars late in their evolution. But I just did a little tiny bit of modelling, very simple bit of modelling, which is if you're going to make dust, you need the elements to make dust. So have a look at the elements being made, which we talked about earlier. When do you get enough elements to make the dust? Because you have to make the elements, then put them in the stars where the dust is made, and wait till the dust is made. And for early galaxies, there just isn't time to do that cycle. So the obvious thing is, well, maybe it's put into dust where the elements are made. Perhaps in the supernova that go off, that's where you make the dust as well as the elements. Now, it was rather an idea that was poo-pooed because it was thought the supernova explosion itself would destroy any dust it made. But, you know, maybe it doesn't. And we looked at that possibility, and over time, I think people have come to accept that, yes, supernova are a viable source of dust. There are observations now that do look at supernova and do detect large quantities of dust. So it looks as though it is a viable mechanism for making dust.
But at the time, when you and your collaborators presented these results, they were met with quite considerable scepticism.
Indeed, but I suppose we're used to scientific scepticism. You do notice, though, over the years that the people who allowed us then seem to be most keen on the idea nowadays.
Clearly discovering the origins of interstellar dust hadn't given you enough to be getting on with, because a couple of years later you embarked on another rather different long-term project involving the Antikythera mechanism. It's an ancient Greek, almost clock-like device for astronomical calculations dating back to 100 BC, something like that.
150 BC, yeah.
I mean, it sounds like something from a movie.
It is in a movie.
It is, isn't it? Listeners might recognise it as the inspiration for the fictional Dial of Destiny, the recent Indiana Jones movie. Okay, Mike, tell me about the real thing.
It's an artifact. It was found in a shipwreck around 1900, and it was brought to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. Nobody realised what it was to begin with. It's just a lump of bronze. However, somebody noticed there were gear wheels in there, and subsequently inscriptions were noticed on the thing that made clear that it had some astronomical